When Princess Alice's entire family fell ill with diphtheria, she tried to care for them, but she was fighting a losing battle. Her youngest daughter, Marie, succumbed to the illness first. When she told her favorite son the news, the little boy broke down into jagged sobs. Unable to see her son in pain, that's when Alice made a fatal error. Princess Alice was born on April 25, 1843, as the third child and second daughter of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. But her birth was not a happy occasion. After the Queen's second-born son, Edward, the public were eagerly awaiting another boy. When that didn't happen, the disappointment was palpable. The Privy Council even sent a letter to her father giving congratulation and condolence. Princess Alice's young life wasn't what most people think. Victoria and Albert weren't just infamously obsessed with each other, they were also all about solid middle-class family values, and they raised their children accordingly. They made Alice and her siblings dress in practical, humble clothing, and they lived in unadorned lodgings without regular heating. Prince Albert even helped design their school curriculum. Alice got along with nearly every sibling in her large family, though she was particularly close to her older siblings, Princess Vicky and Edward, the Prince of Wales. But even so, she wanted something more. She always itched for the world beyond her royal confines, and liked to visit the working-class tenants at Balmoral and find out how they lived. One day, little Alice even escaped from her governess while they were attending Mass in Windsor Castle's chapel. She decided she wanted to sit in the public pews instead of with her family. Headstrong and opinionated, she often lashed out with her tongue when she was angry. When Alice was still a teenager, Queen Victoria decided it was high time she married, especially since Alice's elder sister Vicky had already married in 1858 to Prince Frederick of Prussia. The Queen allowed for the possibility of a love match for Alice, provided she still married into one of the royal houses of Europe. It didn't go as planned. Alice's newlywed sister helped compile a list of eligible European bachelors, and, thanks to the slim pickings of said European bachelors, came up with exactly two men: William, the Prince of Orange, and Prince Albert of Prussia, who just so happened to be her husband's cousin. The Prince of Orange traveled all the way from the Netherlands to Windsor Castle to meet his prospective bride and mother-in-law. Alice disliked him practically on sight, and had no qualms telling her mother about it. And even though Prince Albert came recommended as the cousin of Alice's new brother-in-law Frederick, he failed at the first step. Independent of Alice even meeting him, Frederick himself claimed his cousin wasn't good enough for her, as Alice deserves the very best. So suddenly, Alice's already short list was down to zero. Racking her brains, Alice's sister Vicky eventually landed on Prince Louis of Hesse, who came from a minor, impoverished, but nonetheless respectable German house. Even better, when Alice and Louis met, sparks flew. Louis got Alice's autograph as a keepsake when he left, and Alice told her mother just how attracted she was to the strapping Teutonic man. Queen Victoria immediately made plans to marry the pair. But before that could happen, immense tragedy struck. Alice was formally engaged to Prince Louis in April 1861, but just a month before that, her maternal grandmother died, with Alice acting as her nurse in those final days. Queen Victoria, who'd always had a complicated and spiky relationship with her mother, then fell into a tailspin that Alice also had to run interference on. During these times, her father, Prince Albert, often instructed Alice to go and comfort Mama whenever Victoria broke down into sobs. Then, that December, more awful news. Prince Albert died from typhoid fever or perhaps complications from undiagnosed Crohn's disease. This, too, had deep ramifications for the royal family. Queen Victoria placed the blame for her beloved Albert's demise squarely on her rebellious son and heir, Edward, whose antics she felt had placed fatal stress on her consort. Victoria later wrote that, "I never can or shall look at him without a shudder." Meanwhile, Alice was stuck in the middle again, sometimes comforting her mother and sometimes defying the Queen's orders by staying in contact with Edward. Even after all that, Victoria insisted that Alice's wedding to Prince Louis of Hesse go on as planned. Against all odds, the wedding happened on July 1st, 1862. But by the time it was over, Alice probably wished it had been delayed. The whole palace was still in the throes of mourning for Prince Albert, and no one was trying to hide it. Instead of getting married in a church, Alice had to settle for converting the dining room of her childhood home into a chapel. For the wedding, Alice wore a white gown with a lace veil and held a bouquet of orange blossom and myrtle, a classic royal wedding look. But right before and immediately after the ceremony, Queen Victoria's court mourning protocols forced her to wear only black. And then there was the mother of the bride herself. The heartbroken queen had her sons take her into the makeshift chapel and then requested they stand in front of her to shield her from prying eyes throughout the ceremony. As the wedding went on, Queen Victoria sat on an armchair near the altar and tried not to cry. At the end of the ceremony, the Queen presented Alice with a gold bracelet inlaid with pearls and diamonds from both her and the late Prince Albert. The inscription on the inside said, "To dear Alice, from her loving parents Albert and Victoria are, who though visibly parted, are ever united." Everybody, and I do mean everybody, thought Princess Alice's nuptials were miserable. Queen Victoria called it more of a funeral than a wedding, while the poet Alfred Lord Tennyson said, "It was the saddest day that I can remember." The whole miserable thing was all over by 4 p.m. It was a turning point in Alice's life, and in more ways than one. Alice's induction into marriage introduced her to a whole new set of worries and tensions with her mother. Because while she was in a haze of bridal bliss with Prince Louis, this was utterly repugnant to Queen Victoria. The grieving monarch got so jealous that the princess had to school herself to not look too happy when she was around her mother. Even so, it seemed like Alice could be happy with Prince Louis in his home of Darmstadt in Hesse. When she arrived there in 1862, crowds of her citizens greeted her with cheers, and she wrote to Queen Victoria that, "I believe the people never gave so hearty a welcome." Yet, as the hubbub calmed down, Alice couldn't shake the sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach. Hesse wasn't just provincial, it also simply couldn't accommodate someone of Alice's considerable rank. Queen Victoria had intended Alice to get a brand new palace there, but Prince Louis's father had limited and dwindling coffers and refused to find or build the newlyweds appropriate lodgings. Making the best of it, Alice soon had 2 children, Victoria and Elizabeth, within 2 years of tying the knot with Prince Louis. But even this brought problems. Alice wanted to nurse her own babies, not a common practice at the time, and Queen Victoria hated the thought of her daughter doing it, causing even more tension. Indeed, Alice had a surprisingly comfortable relationship with her body and the bodies of others, even starting up a serious interest in nursing and becoming friends with Florence Nightingale. This nearly destroyed her horrified mother, and Victoria even wrote a warning to Alice's younger sister Louise about Alice's perverse interests. When Louise was headed to visit Alice, the Queen insisted, "Don't let Alice pump you. Be very silent and cautious about your interior." Complicating all this, Queen Victoria simply couldn't let her daughter go. And every passing year that Alice grew more settled in Hesse and visited England less frequently, the Queen grew more critical. But if Victoria wanted to see Alice sad, she should have been very careful what she wished for. On October 7th, 1870, Alice gave birth to her second son and 5th child, Friedrich, aka Fritti. Although the new baby was Alice's firm favorite, there was something seriously wrong from the beginning. As you might know, Queen Victoria was a carrier for the genetic disorder hemophilia, which prevents blood clotting, especially in male children. Unfortunately, she had passed it down to Alice and then to little Fritti. The so-called royal disease, which was currently plaguing the British family, was nothing less than a death sentence at the time. And it would go on to kill Alice's brother Leopold in 1884. Everyone feared the worst for Friedrich. On May 29, 1873, Fritt fell 20 feet after hanging out of a window in his home. The fall might have fatally hurt even a healthy child, but the sickly prince had no chance at all. Although the boy woke up after the tumble, the best doctors in the land couldn't stymie his internal bleeding, and his end followed swiftly. Alice never got over the loss of her beloved son. 2 months after the fall, she wrote to her mother and confessed, "I am glad you have a little colored picture of my darling. I feel lower and sadder than ever and miss him so much, so continually." Throughout Alice's anguish, however, Queen Victoria wasn't much of a boon. Victoria's jealousy had historically clashed with Alice's own single-minded ways, and now they would often get into it through vicious letters. When Alice once gave diplomatic advice to Victoria, the monarch wrote back, "I do not think, dear child, that you should tell me what I ought to do." For 2 whole years, Alice retreated from public life to nurse her wounds as well as her succeeding children. She had 2 girls, Alex and Marie, in 1872 and 1874. To cope with Fritt's absence, she also latched on to her only surviving son, Ernest, promoting him to her new favorite and barely letting him out of her sight. Then there was her marriage. The problems within Alice's union to Prince Louis of Hesse started out slow at first. Although he was a kind man, Louis was also a little soft-headed and could be emotionally stunted. Unfortunately, emotional support was exactly what Alice needed after Friedrich's tragic passing. By 1876, Alice's disappointments with Prince Louis had soured into unbridled resentment. In one letter from the time, she accused him of writing empty and bare letters that left her cold and alienated from her real self, confessing that, "I feel myself through them, that I have less to say to you than any other person." Then, in 1877, Louis's father died, turning him into the Grand Duke of Hesse and Alice into the Grand Duchess. Alice now felt extra pressure in her role and wrote to her mother that she dreaded everything, and it was more than she could stand in the long run. When her mother responded around this time with an unsympathetic letter, Alice confessed it made me cry with anger. I wish I were dead, and it probably will be not too long before I give Mama that pleasure. Worst of all, Alice ended up being right about that. November 1878 cast a dark cloud over the royal household of Hesse. Early in the month, Alice's oldest girl, Victoria, took ill with a sore, stiff neck. The next morning, the doctor took one look at her and diagnosed the girl with diphtheria, a bacterial infection that was often fatal in the Victorian era. Within days, Alice's house turned into a mausoleum. Alice avoided becoming infected at first, but almost no one else in her family was so lucky. 4 of her children, Alex, Marie, Irene, and Ernest, and even her husband fell ill within days of Victoria showing symptoms. Alice tried her best to tend to everyone, but it wasn't enough. On November 15th, Alice's youngest daughter, Marie, who was only 4 years old, fell severely ill. The staff, certain that the girl didn't have long to live, called the Grand Duchess to her bedside. Before she could even make it, Marie had choked, and her body was already turning cold. Although Alice confessed to Queen Victoria that the pain is beyond words when it came to losing Marie, she decided to keep the girl's passing from the rest of her children in the hopes that it wouldn't dampen their spirits while they were also fighting the infection. In her head, it was the best decision, but it would end up being her downfall. After pretending Marie was alive for weeks on end, Alice finally gave in, confessing the truth to her favorite son Ernest in early December. The little boy couldn't believe it at the beginning, and when the reality dawned on him, he broke down into jagged sobs. Unable to see her son in pain, Alice made a fatal error. Before this point, Alice put her whole household under strict no-contact orders. She had even sent her daughter Elizabeth away from the house entirely so she wouldn't get sick. In this one moment, however, she couldn't help comforting her infected favorite son and gave him a kiss to ease his pain. It would be one of the last things she ever did. With this touch, the infection was now moving through Alice's body. She spent her last days on Earth with almost no idea. When her sister Vicky visited a few days after her confession to Ernest, it raised Alice's spirits, and she corresponded with her mother with a hint of resumed cheerfulness. But on Saturday, December 14th, Alice fell incredibly ill with diphtheria, so much so that she barely survived for a few more hours. At 2:30 a.m., she reportedly whispered, "Dear Papa," before losing consciousness. At 8:30 a.m., she died. She was just 35 years old. Incredibly, in addition to her final words about her father, Alice passed on the anniversary of Prince Albert's death 17 years earlier. Queen Victoria, who was always looking for cosmic connections and consolations, couldn't fail to notice this. She called it almost incredible and most mysterious, and lamented that this terrible day come round again. And there was one final twist of fate. Alice's daughter Alex survived diphtheria and grew up to change the world. Just not in a good way. As an adult, Alex married Tsar Nicholas II and became Alexandra Fedorovna, Tsarina of Russia. More than that, she inherited her mother and her grandmother's hemophilia gene, which she then passed on to her son, Alexi. If this is sounding familiar, it should be. Infamously, as a young boy, Alexi got so sick that Alexander recruited the controversial healer, Rasputin, to cure him, angering the Russian people and eventually helping to kickstart the Russian Revolution. Princess Alice's passing hit her nearest and dearest very hard, even and especially her mother. After this, Queen Victoria was all fond remembrances for the daughter she had clashed most with. As she memorialized once, she had darling Papa's nature and much of his self-sacrificing character and fearless and entire devotion to duty. Victoria wasn't the only one. When Alice's sister-in-law met with the royal family after, she reportedly cried out, "I wish I had died instead of her." We think that being a daughter of Queen Victoria should have meant love, luxury, and happiness for Princess Alice of the United Kingdom. Instead, Alice's position overwhelmingly brought her bitterness, betrayal, and one of the most tragic ends in the history of the royal family, Princess Diana included. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel for more stories about history's most fascinating figures.